Hello, everybody,
Welcome back to the AMSA Anatomy Show with your hosts, Miss Abby Samra
and Ms. Tebow. Today we're talking about the circulatory system, and we started doing some work in class about this, but we're going to give you some more details. So if there's some pieces that you haven't quite gotten, we'll try to fill in those pieces for you. These people are Chang and Ang Bunker. They were born in 1811, and if you look at where they're joined, it's just a tiny little band of cartilage in their chest. And they couldn't separate them because they knew even at that time that they shared a circulatory system. And when we do this class, not as a podcast, we usually talk about how you think they might have figured it out. And all kinds of different ideas come up, like, did they share a heart? No, they didn't share a heart. They each had a heart. They each had both sets of organs completely. But they knew that if they cut them, that they would have died. Now today this would be like a super, super easy operation. But how do you think they might have figured it out? So the answer is that one of them ate asparagus, and the other one, when he went to the bathroom, the urine had the smell of the asparagus, which is pretty
distinctive.
Pretty distinctive, Yeah. So they knew that they had blood vessels that were in common, and if they cut that, then they would have severed the blood vessels and they would have bled to death. So that's just kind of a neat thing about the circulatory system. So here's our essential question. So we're talking about sections 1, 2, and 3 in chapter 3. So what is the function of the circulatory system? What are the structures and functions of the heart? What's the path that's taken by blood through the circulatory system? What are the 3 different types of blood vessels? What are the arteries and veins and capillaries? What's their structure and function? What causes blood pressure? What is blood made of? What are the components? And the lymphatic system is a separate system, but it's very closely related to the circulatory system. So what are the components of the lymphatic system?
All right, in our key terms for section 1, we have the cardiovascular system, the heart, atrium, ventricle, valve, capillary, vein, artery, and aorta. For section 2, we have the coronary artery, pulse, diffusion, blood pressure. Section 3, we've got plasma, a red blood cell, hemoglobin, white blood cell, platelet, the lymphatic system, lymph, and lymph nodes. And then section 4, we've got atherosclerosis, which I always have a hard time saying, hypertension, and a heart attack.
So the circulatory system, the job of it is to carry blood and dissolve substances, things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, to and from places in the body. The job of the heart is to pump these things around the body. The heart pumps blood and dissolved substances around the body in tubes called blood vessels, and there's 3 different kinds. And the heart and the blood vessels together make up what we call the circulatory system, and it's also known as the cardiovascular system.
So this is a map of all of your major blood vessels. So you can see everything kind of goes and comes from the heart, and you can see there's a lot of blood vessels like around the lungs where it's going to pick up oxygen, a lot of blood vessels going, up to your head, down your arms and legs. What do you think kind of there in the center of the body, right underneath the heart, there are 2 kind of areas where there's a lot of blood vessels. What do you think that might be?
What do you have in the lower part of your abdomen that there's 2 of? Those are the kidneys. We're not kidding you.
So those are going to help filter your blood. So you are going to have a lot of blood flow to the kidneys to kind of help out as it filters and gets excess water and creates urine from your blood.
Because the kidneys kind of clean your blood. So our circulatory system is what's called the double circulatory system, which means that there's 2 circuits, basically. One, let's start at the lungs. The lungs, we're taking in oxygen, so where you see that little box is red, that tells you that blood coming out of the lungs is oxygenated. So it goes into the left side of the heart and gets pumped out of the heart. So the heart is basically just a pump. It gets pumped out, and then it goes to the body cells, what happens to that oxygenated blood when it's in the body cells? What is that? Why is that oxygen being delivered to the cells? Think about where it might be going. It is the mitochondria. So cellular respiration happens in those body cells. Oxygen is used and carbon dioxide is made. And then that carbon dioxide the blood that contains the carbon dioxide goes to the right side of the heart, gets pumped back up to the lungs and gets oxygenated, and it keeps going around like that. So this is just another diagram that shows the same thing.
One thing that I do want to point out too is that a lot of times we use red to show oxygenated blood and blue to show deoxygenated blood, so the blood that doesn't have any oxygen. Mm-hmm. But in your body, the blood is red the entire time.
Great point.
All right, so this is the heart. Like Miss Tebow said earlier, it's basically just a big pump, but it has a bunch of chambers and a bunch of like weird big tubes coming out of it. So where it says this is a vein, so veins are going to bring blood back to the heart from other parts of the body. So those are going to be some of the tubes coming into the heart. Arteries are going to bring blood away from the heart. So you can think that A, right? Artery away from the heart. And then you have the different chambers of the heart. So you have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So an atrium is where the blood is coming into the heart, and the ventricles are where the blood is leaving the heart. Yeah, so the veins go into the atria, the ventricles go into the arteries.
So again, the heart, the inside view, it's a lot. We're going to show you this in class too, because this is kind of a lot to unpack without actually pointing things out to you. But let's start with the veins from the lungs, okay? Look at the vein from the lungs. It's on the right side.
So looking at it, it's on the right side. But when you're talking about the heart, you're talking about the person's heart. So it would be the heart's left side.
Okay. So veins from the lungs, these are called pulmonary veins. Anytime you see pulmonary, that has to do with the lungs. So this is the vein that brings blood in from the lungs that's been oxygenated because it's just come from the lungs. It gets pumped down from the atrium into the ventricle and then up through the artery to the head and body. And that main artery is called the aorta. That's a major, major artery. It kind of loops around. You'll see that in another picture. Okay, then it goes to the head and body. All the cells and cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. Then it gets pumped back into the heart. And you can see the vein from the head and body. That's called the vena cava. You don't need to know that. And there's one that's bringing blood in from the top of the body and one that's bringing blood in from the lower part of the body. Again, gets pumped into the atrium, into the ventricle, and then back out the pulmonary artery. So if it's pulmonary, it has to do with lungs. This one's going to the lungs. And what keeps the blood from flowing the wrong way are these things called valves. They're sort of like when you're at the subway and you go through the little doors in the subway, they open up, but they don't let you come back in. So
they only open one way.
Yeah. Well,
it's kind of like our down staircase here, right? You can go down, but you can't go back up.
Definitely.
So step 1, blood is coming in from the body and from the lungs. So it's going into the atria. So the way that I remember the word atria is if you know the atrium of a building is kind of the entryway.
And you can use your Latin to kind of think about what these words mean in Latin, and that could be super helpful to you.
Yeah, definitely. So it enters into the atria, right? And this is actually the heart muscle relaxing. So as it relaxes, that area kind of opens up and the blood can rush in. After that, the atria contract, and it's just like squeezing, right? It just squeezes that blood into the ventricles, and we have those valves keeping it all going the right way. After that, the valves are going to, like I said, close to stop the blood from flowing backwards, but then the ventricles contract, and the blood is forced out of the heart, right? And at that point, the atria are actually relaxing again to fill up with blood once again. Right, so it's this constant cycle of The atria contract and push blood into the ventricles. The ventricles contract and push blood out of the heart. The atria contract again to push the blood into the ventricles, right? Back and forth. And that's where that bump bump of your heartbeat comes from.
Yeah. This little animation shows the movement of the blood. You can just watch it for a few seconds. And this diagram shows what some of the valves look like when they're open and what they look like when they're closed. You can look at some of these videos. These are pretty good. Shows you blood flow through the heart, how your heart works. They're pretty short. Okay, so let's talk about blood vessels. There's 3 kinds of blood vessels in our bodies: arteries, veins, and capillaries. And you've already done some work looking at those in the packet that we gave you. There's some diagrams of those. So a vein is thinner. The walls of it are thinner than an artery. If you look at the picture, it shows you 3 layers of tissue. So on the inside, right next to the blood, is a layer of epithelial cells. All of the blood vessels have epithelial cells. In between that, the red layer is smooth muscle, and it's just a thin little layer. And then on the outside is connective tissue that's a little bit tougher.
So this is an artery. The walls of this one are going to be much thicker. So as the blood rushes out of the heart, that's a lot of stuff going through these blood vessels. So it wants to have a little bit more padding, kind of, to help protect it. So you still have that layer of epithelial cells on the inside. Like we said, all of them have that. And you get that thicker, smooth muscle. And that's going to add a little bit of protection. And then again, that layer of connective tissue on the outside.
Okay. Now, capillaries are surrounding the cells. We call this little area a capillary bed. And this is just a single layer of epithelial cells. One little red blood cell at a time can squish through that capillary, and they connect arteries and veins. So again, arteries, thick muscle and elastic fibers in the middle. And arteries carry blood away from the heart, artery away. And they're stretchy. They allow the artery to stretch under pressure, which is really important. And the thick muscle contracts to push the blood along. The vein, again, as Ms. Abusammer said, is thinner. The muscle in between is much thinner. And the veins carry blood toward the heart. And they have these, they don't have their own, they can't pump the blood. The blood doesn't have pressure really going through it. So they have valves which prevents the blood from going in the wrong direction. So artery away, veins have valves. So it's the muscles in our body that pushes the blood along in the veins. Right, and this shows a photomicrograph of an artery on top and a vein at the bottom, so you can see the difference.
And then the capillaries, like we said, are what's in between, right? So it goes away from the heart and the arteries through a capillary bed and then up through the veins. And like we said, these are only 1 cell thick, the walls of capillaries, super, super small. And that's so that everything can diffuse through, right? So super small, only 1 blood cell is making it through these capillaries, and super thin so that all of the oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients can all get through the walls of the capillaries and actually get to your body cells.
And they just diffuse through. If you remember what that means, it's when things move from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. So the oxygen is going to be moving into where there's less oxygen. All right, here's another picture of the capillaries. We talked about capillary bed as just a whole cluster of capillaries surrounding the cells. All right, now let's talk about blood. All right, what's it made of? First of all, what do you think this diagram is showing? Is this a vein or an artery? I see something in the middle there that might give me a clue.
It might be a vein.
So blood is made up of 45% of blood is cells, and the rest is what's called plasma. So we'll talk about what each of these components are. So red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma, carbon dioxide, digested food, hormones, oxygen, and waste products. So your blood is really rich in a lot of different things.
All right, so plasma is kind of the liquid part of your blood. So we think about our blood being this like thick red substance, but most of that we're seeing is actually the blood cells. So our blood is red because of the red blood cells. Most of our blood is just plasma. It's mostly water, so plasma is 90% water. You also have some like proteins floating around in there, little other things, and it's kind of just this pale yellowish color. It's almost clear.
So if we took our blood and put it in a test tube and spun it around in a centrifuge. A centrifuge is sort of like a really super fast merry-go-round for test tubes. This is what we would end up with. All the red blood cells would be at the bottom because they're the heaviest. They'd be pulled to the bottom because there's iron in them and stuff. And then in the middle there would be white blood cells and platelets, and then the plasma would be at the top. So the other parts of our blood, red blood cells, the job of these red blood cells, they kind of look like, how would you describe it? It's like a snow tube almost. Like it's like a donut that isn't really pushed through all the way.
Yeah.
How would you describe that shape?
Yeah, like there are some like pool floaties that like don't actually go all the way through.
Yeah. So that's kind of their shape, and they're kind of flexible. They can squish a little bit to get through those capillaries. And the job of the red blood cell, the main job of them, is to carry oxygen through the body. So that's their job. The white blood cells are kind of bigger than the red blood cells, and they're puffy. These are the job of them. These work with the immune system to find disease-causing organisms and to fight off these intruders and diseases. And then platelets, these form clots. Like when you cut yourself, they'll all kind of gather together and weave themselves together and form a clot, and then eventually scab, but they'll prevent you from bleeding out, which is really important. So we said that the red blood cells were biconcave discs, so kind of like we talked about the pool floaties. And what's interesting is red blood cells don't have a nucleus, so that's kind of an interesting thing.
It's kind of weird.
It is kind of weird. You can look at that little video at the bottom, and they contain hemoglobin, which is a protein molecule that contains iron, and this hemoglobin holds the oxygen and carries it to the cells, and that's what makes your blood bright red. And we talked about the fact that red blood cells can squish a little bit and change their shape and be able to kind of smoosh through the capillaries. So this is kind of neat. Our red blood cells live about 120 days, and we have about 2 million that die every second, but that same amount is produced every second. And where, do you remember where they're produced?
It was the bone marrow.
All right, this is kind of fun and interesting.
All right, so what happens to dead red blood cells? So dead red blood cells are collected by the spleen. It's an organ we haven't really talked about too much.
But look at where it is. It's right next to your stomach. It's kind of behind your stomach.
Yeah. And they're sent to the liver. Since they have no nucleus, they can't reproduce. So the liver is just going to break them down into bilirubin, which gets excreted from the body. And that's actually what gives your feces its brownish color, right? So think about that red color combined with all of the other stuff that you're eating and everything like that. That's what gives you that brown color. But their average lifespan is about 3 to 4 months. So constantly you're breaking red blood cells down, right? The spleen and the liver are working really hard to kind of get all that junk out of your body. All right, so another name for white blood cells is leucocytes. There are much fewer white blood cells than red blood cells. So you have about 1 white blood cell per about 500 to 1,000 red blood cells. Like we said, they're going to be much larger, and they're also going to live longer. So they can live months to actually a couple of years. But there are a couple of different types of white blood cells. You don't need to know too much about the different types, but they all do have a really big nucleus, unlike that red blood cell.
This picture just shows, you can just look at these on your own. There's different kinds of white blood cells, and we don't really need to go into too much detail about these. There's just different types. Macrophages eat and digest microorganisms. Lymphocytes fight diseases and make antibodies. Lymphocytes make antitoxins to break down poison. So they're sort of like taking really good care of you is what they're doing. All right, platelets, we said they're little bits of cells that are broken off of larger cells, and they produce these little fibers called fibrinogen fibers. And when you get a cut, they kind of all come in and they form a little net, and it traps the blood cells, forms a little blood clot, and turns into a scab to heal.
So blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force against the walls of the blood vessel, and it's caused by the ventricles contracting. So as your heart squeezes all of that blood out, right, all that blood is rushing into the blood vessels. So it's kind of like when you're in the cafeteria and you all get dismissed, right? You all kind of rush to the door and you all are trying to squeeze through, right? You're pushing against that door frame, right? Your blood is doing the same thing in your blood vessels, right? So it's all pushing against your blood vessels and causing this pressure.
It's a great analogy.
So it's going to be much stronger near the heart, right where all of that blood is kind of rushing through. And we measure it. Oh my gosh, I always pronounce
This is
this
such
wrong.
a fun word to say. Sphygmomanometer. So it's got mom in it. That's why it's such a great word. Sphygmomanometer. So when you go to the doctor and you get your blood pressure taken, you can go, hey, that's a really nice sphygmomanometer you got there.
Yeah, so you've all had your blood pressure taken, right? It's the cuff that kind of squeezes your arm and then slowly releases. So it's seeing how much pressure there is in your blood vessels when your heart basically is contracted over when it's relaxed, right? So your typical blood pressure would be about 120 over 80.
So blood types, we're going to talk a little bit about blood types next year too when we talk about genetics, like what causes you to have different blood types as far as the genes go. But basically you have markers on your blood, on your blood cells that are carbohydrates that are clumping proteins, and we call these antigens. You don't really need to know those names right now. But there's an A antigen, there's a B antigen. So you can have your blood cells have only A antigens, or they can only have B antigens, or they can have both kinds of antigens, or they can have no antigens. And it's really important to know your blood type, because if you get blood, like a transfusion or blood donated to you of a different blood type, your body might not recognize, like let's say you had type B blood and you got blood from somebody who was type A blood. Your immune system would not recognize those type A antigens, and it would reject it. So it would cause like big problems, maybe even death. So it's really important to know what kind of blood you have. Now, could somebody with type AB blood, could they get blood from a type A donor?
Yeah,
Would
they could.
Yeah, their body would recognize that A antigen. They could also get blood from a B donor because their body would recognize that too, and they can get blood from an O donor. Okay, so type AB are called universal recipients because they can get blood from anybody. But who can they give blood to? Who can they give blood to? They can only give blood to type AB. Okay, type O blood is known as the universal donor because they can give blood to anybody and it's going to be okay. Other people's bodies are not going to reject type O blood because there's no antigens at all. Maybe I'll tell you the story right now. I was going to tell you next year, but you'll remember it next year. Type O blood got the name, as far as I know anyway, is that it was written as type 0 because there were 0 antigens on it, but somebody read it as a O and not a 0.
And it just
So
kind
it's,
of stuck.
it's literally a typo, which I think is terrific. So anyway, we'll talk about that more next year too.
This just shows like the percentage of the population that have each of these blood types. So you can see things like O positive, and we didn't really get into the positive or negative, but that's basically just another antigen that you can have on your blood. But O positive is going to be one of the most common, right? 38% of the population, whereas only 1% has AB negative. That's barely anyone.
All right, so lymphatic system, this is the network of vessels that return the plasma, the fluid, to the bloodstream. It's not really plasma, it's called lymph. And this fluid leaks out of the capillaries. And now once it's in these vessels, it's called lymph. And it bathes cells in materials that they need, like water and glucose and white blood cells. And you can think of them as like gutters. They drain into these lymph vessels. There's no pump. They move super slowly, and they connect to veins in the chest and become plasma. And you can see, like, go to the doctor and have them check your lymph nodes. So there's a lot of white blood cells in your lymph nodes, and when you are sick, those lymph nodes can get swollen. So look at the picture. You can see, like, in your throat you have a lot, sort of in your armpits you have a lot, like at the tops of your legs you have a lot. So those lymph nodes are those little knobs of tissue that filter the lymph, traps bacteria and microorganisms and white blood cells.
All right. So some diseases or disorders. So atherosclerosis. I still can't say that word.
Some words in biology are just kind of tough to say.
They are.
It's okay.
It's all that Latin roots, and I've never taken Latin. You guys have an advantage in that case. So you can have a buildup of basically fatty cholesterol. So every time, adults are talking about bad cholesterol, this is basically what we're talking about. Basically in the coronary arteries, so these are the arteries that bring blood to the heart muscles, right? So you have blood constantly going through your heart. You also need a supply of blood to the outside of your heart, right? So that the muscles that are actually make up your heart have their blood supply. And when that blood flow gets reduced or blocked off, that causes a heart attack, right? So your muscles in your heart are trying to pump, but they run out of oxygen, right? So that's super, super not good.
Yeah, if you look at the little pictures, you can see if that yellow fatty buildup, it makes the opening a lot smaller, so less blood can flow through.
Yeah. And then we also have hypertension. So this is high blood pressure. So we said, blood pressure is that kind of force against the walls of your blood vessels, right? If you have too much stuff in your blood, like eating a lot of salt can cause hypertension. And remember, when we talked about osmosis, we said that water is going to kind of follow salt around, right? If there's an area where there's a lot of salt, that water is going to kind of follow and diffuse to that area. So if you eat a lot of salt and you have a lot of salt in your blood, you're also going to have a lot of water, and that's just kind of a lot of stuff to be in your blood vessels and a lot of pressure pushing outwards. And that can mean that your heart is working too hard to push it all through, and it can cause all kinds of other issues.
So if you look at the little diagram, like your genes, you can't really do anything about your genes, but the way your genes are expressed, we'll talk about that next year. You do have a lot of control over the environment, your level of activity. There's ways you can help deal with stress, trying to keep your weight at a healthy level, tobacco, not using tobacco or other things that are super bad for your body. Age, I can't really do much about that.
Mm-hmm.
Salt and other substances that could affect your health in this way. So these things work together and can either make your chance of having hypertension higher or help make it lower. So things you can do to keep your heart healthy, like we said before: exercise, keeping your body active, eating a good diet with lots of fruits and vegetables, and no smoking, no bad chemicals in your body.
Yeah.
So take a look at the heart diagram. Be prepared to work on this in class. Figure out what all these parts are and which direction the blood flows. So we'll figure that out.
We will see you in class. Thanks for watching.
Bye.